All right, we are back with Malcolm X Learning to Read, and we're sort of on our final video here. We're going to look today on how we can talk about the entire argument as one whole using a framework called SOAPSTONE. So we're going to look at this last little excerpt here to kind of refresh our memory on his argument, and then we're going to move on and talk about the argument as a whole. But I'm digressing. So this is how he finishes his whole argument. Basically, digressing means, but I'm making something, I'm going off track here. So he's like, whoa, 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 I'm getting off task. I'm getting off track talking about civil rights and human rights. Let me get back on track. I want to talk about learning to read. I told the Englishman that my alma mater was books, a good library. Every time I catch a plane, I have with me a book that I want to read. And that's a lot of books these days. If I weren't out here every day battling the white man, I could spend the rest of my life reading, just satisfying my curiosity, because you can hardly mention anything I'm not curious about. I don't think anybody ever got more out of going to prison than I did. In fact, prison enabled me to study far more intensively than I would have if my life had gone differently and I attended some college. I imagine that one of the biggest troubles with colleges is that there are too many distractions, too much hanty-rating, fraternities, bula bula, and all that. Where else but in prison could I have attacked my ignorance by being able to study intensely, sometimes as much as 15 hours a day? So he's reminding us at the end of this excerpt about what his overall claim was. Look, I was able to get this education because of the way that my life went, because I was able to study so intensively, and because I was able to educate myself. Let's look at a SOAPSTONE framework. If you're unfamiliar with SOAPSTONE, this is a rhetorical analysis framework. Rhetorical analysis is what you do when you're reading an argument. Rhetoric is basically the art of arguing. It's a way you can think of it. When you're analyzing something, what you're doing is breaking it into pieces to examine them or how they all build up the whole text. So you're looking at individual pieces, then putting them back together to see what it shows you about the text as a whole. SOAPSTONE is a rhetorical analysis framework, meaning it's a good way for us to break down the parts of our argument so that we can look at it. So SOAPSTONE stands for speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, and tone. It's an acronym, meaning that each of these letters stands for a different thing that you're going to look at for the text. So let's start with speaker. Who is the speaker of this text? Well, you might think, well, that's really easy. They usually tell us who the author is. Okay, so we know that part. It's Malcolm X. But here's what we need to also do. What else do we know about this speaker? Okay, we know that he was an activist during the civil rights era. We know that he was really someone who was a proponent of violent action. And we know that he was self-educated during his time in prison. Those are things that we actually know about the speaker. You want to give as much information as you possibly can. One other thing that you can think about when you're discussing each of these elements is the rhetorical techniques that might be involved. So when we're talking about the speaker, we're going to talk about ethos. If you've forgotten what ethos is, it's sort of like appeals to credibility, trustworthiness, and good character. So we can think about, what does Malcolm X do that we know is an appeal to his credibility, his trustworthiness, or his good character? In an argument, you can't actually make an appeal to ethos. However, you do have these references to ethos type things when you're naturally writing an argument. So what are some things that he does to build up his credibility, his trustworthiness, his good character? Well, he references a lot of his books that he reads that are of merit. He also mentions people who were his mentors, who were really important people. He also gives us his own personal background. Because he's so transparent with us about how he learned to read and how he got an education, it actually builds his credibility as a speaker, because he's not making something up. He's telling us the truth of what his life was and how he did learn to read. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to think about the occasion. Okay, so occasion is the context and the background of why this specific author is writing it at this specific time. So we talked about the exigence pretty early on. Do we remember what it is that is kind of sparking this? Well, obviously we know it's still the civil rights era. Sorry, I'm having trouble with all my fonts and my size and everything. I want to make it so you can still read it. We know that it's still the civil rights era. And we know that the occasion here is, this is his autobiography. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in here. This is his autobiography. He's getting a chance to go back and write about things that happened in his life. It's the civil rights era, and it's also probably going to be a little bit important that we talk about what might else be going on. We know that this is during the same time period as Martin Luther King Jr., but really, they sort of disagree. They don't have a lot of the same background or a lot of the same ideology. So the things that are going on in America are kind of going to be important when we think about contrast here. Okay, that's pretty much all we need to talk about when we're talking about occasion. Of course, we could talk about more, but we're going to move on for now and think about audience. Okay, audience. Who is he writing for? Well, because this is a book, we know that we're going to be looking at people who are readers and maybe people who are activists themselves and people who know who Malcolm X is. This audience is probably going to be people who already agree with Malcolm X's intentions and his beliefs about how people can earn rights. When we're thinking about rhetorical choices here, something that we also might want to take into consideration is pathos. Let me just get my text here. Okay, pathos. Okay, if you don't remember what pathos is like we talked about earlier, the same root as pathetic. Pathos is appeals to emotions and characteristics that maybe the audience might feel a connection to or might have some sort of reaction to. So pathos, we're going to think about how is he inspiring an emotional reaction in his audience? Well, he tells us about his time in his childhood and how he got to prison, which might sort of maybe encourage pity or even sympathy and empathy, depending on how much you connect with that. If you know people who have struggled with similar things, or you might feel more empathetic. If you're someone who really identifies with his struggle but might not have the same things, you might feel sympathetic. However, if you don't identify with those, you might just feel pity. All of those are still pretty strong emotions that he's evoking here. Okay, what other emotions might he have? Well, he might be provoking anger because of all of his references of the different types of oppression that have happened in the world for various peoples. What other emotions might he inspire? Well, maybe it's his ultimate goal that he wants to sort of invigorate you and encourage you to make some changes and educate yourself in the same way that he found education. Maybe. Let's think now about his purpose. So really what we want to think about here is his overall claim, okay? What is Malcolm X's claim? I think that two things we might need to think about here are his explicit claim and his implicit claim. Explicit means it is what the author is actually telling you. An implicit claim is what you have to read between the lines. So his explicit claim is pretty much going to be given to us in the title. Self-educate. You should educate yourself like he has. That is his claim. That is his argument. Nothing about your current education system or the school system is going to teach you what you need to know. You need to pick up a book, you need to learn to read, and you need to educate yourself. I'm pretty positive that's his explicit claim. That's what he's telling us over and over. But what's his implicit claim? What can you read between the lines and see what he might be saying in addition? The latter half of his essay leads us here. Because what he's actually saying is, what you need to do is educate yourself so that you can get human rights. Because people aren't educated about the history and perhaps even the various oppressions that go on across the globe for people of minorities or people of color, or as we have often said in modernity, people of the global majority. So often we refer to people as of color as minorities, but really they make up the majority of the world, the global majority. So what he's really saying here is explicitly, self-educate, learn what your history, learn for yourself and on your own. Don't trust that anyone will tell you the truth. What his implicit claim is, you need to educate yourself so that you can go out and fight for your human rights, because they're not going to be handed to you. They're not going to be given to you willingly. You're going to need to fight for them. Okay, let's keep going. Let's go now to the subject. So what we really want to look for here is, how is he building things with reasoning and evidence? We're lucky in Malcolm X because he gives us reasons and evidence pretty strongly. He gives us books. He gives us the evidence by citing books. And that's a really great way to make yourself known and to make your argument clear about the subject of self-education, is he references things specifically. Another thing to take into part here is logos, which is our third part of our rhetorical triangle. And mostly logos is thought of as how people make appeals to data and statistics and things like that. But really, it's just, how do you make evidence that supports your claim? And I really think that this is a really great argument for this, because basically all he's doing is giving evidence that supports his claim. He's giving a lot of anecdotal evidence, anecdotal evidence, which means he's giving his own personal stories. He's giving us allusions, which means he's referencing other texts and people. So he's kind of referencing other things that support what he's saying. And then what he's also doing to bring his claim of self-education and why it's important is he gives us this because. So that's something that you want to connect back to that purpose and that claim. Why should you be self-educated? Well, because, and then his whole essay is basically a list of reasons, a list of evidence that proves his claim. Okay, and then our last thing we're going to talk about here is tone. So tone can change over the course of the text, so it's really fine if you want to come up with multiple tones. In fact, I would recommend coming up with at least 3. Talk about what is the author's tone at the beginning, what is their tone in the middle, and what is their tone at the end. If there's any other really important things that happen throughout the text, you might also want to refer to those. But we really want to think about beginning, middle, and end, and talk about how the tone shifts over the course of the passage. So, at the beginning of the passage, how might we talk about Malcolm X's tone? You might want to say that it's very straightforward. How might we want to talk about his tone at the middle of the passage? Really, what he's doing is really educating us. And what we might think about his tone toward the subject of education and toward his own lack of getting this education because the school system was so against him, is maybe he feels enraged. He feels enraged that he hasn't been able to get the education that was that should have been afforded to him, and maybe enraged about what he's learning about the history of the world. But this is not just, just careless rage. This is justified. This is justified enrage. So justful, justified. He really is justified here. Let's think about his tone at the end. I'm gonna say he's almost reflective. Maybe you could even say more, he's encouraging. Of course, as you're going through the SOAPSTONE, your answers might be different than mine, and that's totally fine. Having more than one reading of a text is actually gonna be more important. When you're thinking about a text overall, you wanna think about the complexities. So here we have just a quick run through of a SOAPSTONE and thinking about this text as a whole. But what we're doing is a rhetorical analysis. Think about these different parts and how do they connect to actually prove that you understood the argument the author was trying to make. Hopefully that is a helpful overview of rhetorical analysis and rhetoric in general. I'm glad that you were able to join me in these lessons for Malcolm X's Learning to Read. I hope to do more of these in the future. Let me know if you liked it and let me know what you'd like to see.